adenine, we have the thiamine, and we have the
number. No, then maybe you go ahead. You go ahead as we organize, and you can give Tacit his number. Yes. Okay. So Arop will come in as we wait for Machot. Machot is supposed to be online, but we are not able to reach him as yet. So I'll request Arop to just come in. So your presentation is already there. I'll allow you to just start because of time. It's 3 o'clock, and we want to give you 15 minutes. And then I know our moderator is going to help us. So kindly just carry on. Thank you. Karibu.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? So good afternoon. I feel a bit worried for starting talking to people in a very heavy, complicated, topic after a good meal. In Sudan, we say that if you want to talk to people with full stomach, either to be very entertaining or to be very quiet so as to let them sleep. So I'm trying to be very entertaining. We also say that if you give a mic that is working fine for the Sudani people, it's very difficult for them to let it go. So I'm also trying to manage my time. So I'm working on Bija people in Eastern Sudan. And this work has started in 2020, where we started the Osun online seminar on oral history and oral literature. And we actually started from that point, and then I tried to expand the research more and more. My main thing is I am working on how Bija people are using orality in terms of poems, songs, stories, and so on, in order to express their identity as an indigenous group. And I became interested in this actually because this is a very growing and heating debate in Sudan nowadays, especially after the revolution of 2018-2019. Where people, especially who have been, historically marginalized, started to claim for their rights, social, political, and economic rights, started to call for more, fair share of wealth and resources. But the way they used to do this is not by saying we are Sudanese citizens and we deserve to be equally, treated. This was coming in a form of we are the indigenous groups, we are the owners of the land, we are the historical founders of this country, and that's why we need to, be treated fairly. So I was looking at this thing from the perspective of Bija groups. Next. Next slide. Yes. So just for those who do not have like a background on Bija people are actually in Eastern Sudan, and Eastern Sudan is composed of 3 states. The region is bordering one of the most important neighbors for Sudan, which is Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt. It's also the only Sudan's gate. It's the only coastline, and it has the only port in the country. The Bija are estimated to be about 4 million, and this is a very old statistics because we didn't have census in Sudan since 2008 and before the secession or the separation of South Sudan. The main groups are Hadandawa, Amarar, Artega, Bushariyin, Halanga, and Bani Amir. And I put Bani Amir in red because there is a big debated issue whether Bani Amir as a group are actually considered as Bija or not. The main languages are Badawiyat and Tigrayat. The Badawiyat is usually spoken by Hadandawa, Amarar, Bushariyin, and Halanga, but the Tigrayat is spoken by Bani Amir. The main religion, I don't think this is visible, but the main religion is Islam, Sufi kind of Islam. And also the Bija are very much known for their silif, which is a very local customary law that actually govern the Bija's social and legal life. Next. So just to situate the context in which I was working, this context, I decided to put it starting from the Sudan's uprising from 2018, and what happened after that, and how this has escalated the issue of Bija as an indigenous group. First of all, there is a lot of ethnic conflicts going on in the 3 states directly after the falling of the regime of Omar al-Bashir. And then from that point, a very big peace talks started all over the country, including what is called the Eastern Track, which is the representative negotiating track on behalf of the Eastern region. But the problem is that this Eastern Track was not considered as representative to Bija people according to their view, or according at least to the view of part of them. And this is where the escalations of ethnic politics started to grow up within the civil transitional government of that time in July 2020. And then the Juba Peace Agreement, regardless of all these disputes, was signed in October 2020, and it was signed with the existence of part of the Eastern Track. This Eastern Track was galvanizing around certain parts of Bija, including the Bani Amir group, but not the Hadendawa. And this is where the things started to escalate. According to this, 2 conferences have been made, one in December 2020 in a place called Telkuk, and this was made by the pro-Bija, the pro-Juba Peace Agreement groups, and then another one was made in April 2021 by the anti-Juba Peace Agreement group, including the Hadendawa. The 2 places that were chosen for these conferences were actually historically very remarkable for Bija people. And both of them were actually remarks that history was made in these areas where Bija people fought for their freedom and their justice, and now they are doing the same again, but for a national, or again, it's a national government and not a colonizer power. After April 2021, something called the High Council of Bija, Nizarat and Independent Chiefdoms was established, and this council is now considered itself as the main representative of Bija groups, and it's calling basically into rejecting the Juba Peace Agreement and the Eastern Track. They don't want this anymore, and they refused this agreement completely. And they went further than that by closing the Port Sudan, the main port of Sudan, in September 2021. And at the end of the day, after the military coup took place in Sudan, the government had to compromise, the military government now had to compromise with this council. And one of the responses that they made in order to, get, to reach an agreement with these people was to form 2 high committees, one for identity revision, claiming that a lot of people are claiming to be Bija while they are not, so we need a committee to look at this identity more seriously, and the other one was for borders delineation, claiming also that the Bija region has been attacked by the Ethiopians, by the Eritreans, and we need our internal and external borders to be demarcated, including having an based kind of borders. And these two committees has started working in May 2020. Next. So the research question was basically about what creates a sense of indigenous community among Bija. How do Bija consider or define themselves as indigenous? Is it the language they use? Is it the common grievances that they face together? Is it their current mobility? What is it? How it is related to their local language? How is it related to their historical grievances? More importantly, how the community identification among Bija is articulated and interconnected with the narrations they have about their history, because there is so many different narrations for that history. And how do Bija use the oral literature they have in order to push for creating these narrations that best represent them? And then how the overall context we are living in nowadays, socio-political context, can affect or change or reinforce the Bija's sense of belonging to their community, and how have the different grievances have fostered new or old modes of belonging among community members. What kind of community have been shaped out of this? Next. The methodology I use is quite simple, but also very difficult to work with, which is I analyze the abstract texts that I managed to collect and translate that include poems, stories, and then I also analyze the empirical data I got from interviews. This is a qualitative-based research, so I work basically with interviews. The field work started 2020, as I mentioned, when we did the seminar, and it continued until this April. The main point I have was to look at how Bija express themselves through their literature, what this abstract text can say about them, and then what they themselves can say about themselves personally. And I did this because basically when I started my first fieldwork, I had nothing to do with songs and poetry. I have never listened to it before. And I realized that when I came the next time, explaining and talking to people with a background that I got not from academic literature, not from other people saying about Bija, but from what they produce as oral literature, it just turned completely different. People were very interactive with me because we are actually have something in between to talk about, which is their songs and their poems. Next. Next. So this study has a lot of limitations, to be honest. The language barriers is one of them. The Bija people are, they speak Arabic as a second language, but they are natively speaking Badawiyat and Tigrayat. But in general, we had to do the interviews in Arabic, and at some point, translation was a big issue for me. The dominant gender roles among Bija as well, it was very weird. It was phenomenal, actually, to have a woman coming from the center of Khartoum to speak to Bijawi men about something that is completely native for them. That was a big question mark. It was even difficult to find a place where men and women can meet, that can be socially acceptable. For a lot of reasons, I couldn't do interviews with people, not because they are not interested, but because they really cannot find a place where people would accept them sitting with me in one area together without, many doubts going on. So it's quite difficult, especially in rural areas. And then the political polarization that is characterizing the whole country nowadays between civil and military, between right and left, and so on. And then also the lack of documentation over the oral resources that I was working on, plus the logistical barriers related to the overall situation. But I have to mention that trying to mitigate these kind of limitations has actually enriched this research very much, because over the time I turned into a researcher and a subject of research at the same time. I was very much involved and immersed in dealing with these limitations in order to go on with the fieldwork. And this has actually enriched. My name is Arub, for example, and Arub is mistakenly linked to being Arab, and this was one of the biggest disadvantages. I am unmarried woman as well. This is another disadvantage. I am educated. This is a third disadvantage among Bija. I am from Khartoum. I don't speak their language. There's a lot of things for them not to accept me, but then that's why these conversations we had were very more, genuine. It was very challenging, and that's what made it actually very genuine. Next. Okay. So looking at the bright side, apart from all of the limitations I keep complaining about, is looking at how the oral history of Bija have a lot of contested narrations. My aim was not to look at these narrations and try to compromise or come up with a consensual narration. In fact, I was interested in the opposite, which is to look at the divergence of the narration, why the narration take a certain point and then it turn out different from one person to another, and how these differences came from, and what kind of relation between the different relations and people's positionalities, current positionalities and historical positionalities. So these are one of the most contested things that the Bija people always mention. One of them is their roots. Are they Egyptian? Are they African roots? Are they Arab? This was one of the biggest debated things. But in general, there is always a very good justification for why people consider themselves as Egyptian originated or Arab originated. Those who have the ability to get integrated with Arab oriented groups of northern Sudan were more interested in the narration of being Arab. those who are very much anti the Muslim Brotherhood system that was governing Sudan for a long time, were very much against the Arab narration and very much interested in the African narration for being completely African. Those who were living in the borders, especially in Halaib area close to Egypt, were trying to say we are a borderline community, we are always been here, so we are consider ourselves as Egyptian and Sudanese at the same time. Another very crucial point is the Islam among Bija and how the Islamization of Bija. Some narrations would going in the direct that Bija have been forcibly Islamized during to political regimes that were Islamic oriented, while others were saying the complete opposite, that religion in Bija was very old, it's very indigenized. Bija people were very much involved in Islam from the beginning, and so on. And both of the groups have their own narrations of history. They have their own versions to be told. The third one is the Mahadist revolution. This is a revolution, a national revolution that was made 1880 to 1885. And this is where the Bija people were actually fighting against the British colonialization of that time. And at that time, a poem was written called the Fuzzy for those who don't know it. It was written by a British poet, and it was about how there is a credibility for Bija people as brave fighters who broke the English square, the famous English military square during these the battles. The Bija are still feeling very proud about this Fuzzy, and the Fuzzy is actually a reference to their buffy hair, their style of hair until this moment. So, instead of this very pride and very, light kind of narration, there is another narration that Bija were actually marginalized community along the way. Under the British, under the Mahadist, under the national government, they were marginalized and underdeveloped. Next. Yes. So, speaking about orality among Bija, I think it's very, very much interesting to look at how Bija's culture, the oral culture is working. One of the things that were really very fascinating for me is the culture of Sakanab. The Sakanab is mainly referring to the news. Bija people like to exchange information and news through the issue of Sakanab. And one of them was telling me a Bijawi traveler might pack his coffee, might pack his camel, his needs, and the news that he is going to take to his family back home. Therefore, a man might specifically visit the market before leaving the town just to know the updated prices, because this is one of the most important information that people need to know. So the second app was actually a way of establishing rapport. Even for me, when I come, the first thing before I get any information from them is to give some information back. And second app was not something done by all the Bija who are living in the desert as nomadic people. No, it is done until the moment, and even there is digital platforms called second app, continue the culture itself. For the poems and songs, they are actually a very discursive platform. People actually perform poetry and songs not as something open, but rather establishing some sort of dialogue with their audience. Next. Okay, actually the previous slide has a video, but in any ways, there is no need for the video, I think, because we are running out of time. Yeah. But in general, what I wanted to say is that the oral poetry among Bija is turning from a common ground into a battleground. For example, this is one of the translations that we have been working on, which is telling how the Bija people were very much good fighters. They were very much, brave in defending their country. Next. Looking at the next one, which is another song that is also very famous. Here, people are saying something completely different, which is how demarcating their land and how they are challenging the others by saying the kingdoms are ours, the borders are ours, in a kind of a provoking way for other neighboring Bija people, which means that instead of talking about their unity as an indigenous group, they started to talk about how they have, rights over each other and how each one of them is more authentic than the other and each one of them has more rights compared to other. Next. I was actually very interested in speaking to women because they are completely absent from all of the readings that I found about Bija. It was difficult even for me to reach them. But what I found is that they say, one of them mentioned, Bijawi women are portable museums, which is partially true. They are the ones who are actually keeping the heritage. This is a photo of me. I was very embarrassed from this photo at the beginning. But when I asked the women about what do you do to keep your heritage alive, they said, why should we express it for you? Let's just dress up and show you what we're doing, which is basically show the functionality of using the heritage rather than talking about it. They are actually living it. Next. Finally, I think the context of Sudan's revolution 2018 and 2019 is very much influencing the debate of Bija as an indigenous group, because in a way or another, it's appeal for recognition. It's appeal for cultural, economic, political recognition using something very valuable such as oral literature. And I think the Sudan revolution was very much a cornerstone for me because it was the point where everything has just brought up and unpacked out of nowhere. This was not a debate that we were, ready to have at that point. At the moment, people were talking about peace agreements, coming together, national unity. The Bija were calling for self-determination. And I think that was, just an accumulation of a long, failure of the state for, management of diversity. Next. This is the conclusions I have, which is basically how ethnopolitics in Sudan, and especially in the East, are very dominant mechanism of political mobilization and polarization as well. And I think also it's very difficult to understand Bija's culture without serious engagement with their oral literature and the dynamic roles that that literature have over their lives. But for Bija, poetry is not just a social tradition, it's a serious discursive platform. And the instrumentalization of this heritage, this oral literature, in the current political discourse, is actually contributing into reshaping the identity of Bija as an indigenous group, including their perceptions about, indigeneity. Most of important that preservation of Bija's heritage is actually highly depending on the gender roles played by Bijawi women, despite the invisibility of these roles from the public discourse. Next. Thank you. I hope I didn't took a very long.
Need to clap for a rope because this is a lady who's done a great job. She tells you she comes from Khartoum, and I remember at one point when she was doing her research, we had to agree with the advisor that do we call off because she was working under very difficult circumstances. She had to hide, she had to move from one town to another, and when she presents this, you just imagine, we are so, so grateful. We are so grateful. The advisor was Janice Body, who is actually a professor of anthropology, University of Toronto. Thank you so, so much. I want to believe Machot is there. Machot, are you there? Yes, I can see Machot. Machot, kindly speak to us.
Rosemary?
Wow.
Yes.
Please just speak.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
And we are giving you 15 minutes. Kindly, please.
Do you?
Yes, we can hear you. Go on.
I have to thank Rup for the wonderful presentation. I happen also to be one of the Sudanese people on the other side of Sudan, which is South Sudan. And as Rup was highlighting about the Sudanese politics of identity, of course, even if the two Sudans continue to be one of the challenging, and of course the culture, society, and how people control the narratives of the cultures, and also the history about the structure of the country, of course, played in a lot of roles. So my presentation also will focus on the same, more or less, related understanding around the cultures of history. And I'm going to talk about songs which are a very important element of the society. Of course, they also play into the culture of orality. Of course, South Sudan, as one of the countries, continue to be an oral society, majorly because the history of documentation for us and for the country generally has not been more than 2 centuries. And of course, everything is passed on from generation to generation using all the means of orality, including songs. So my topic of study is how history is represented through songs. And I conducted these interviews in a place called Lake State, and in Lake State in South Sudan, which is the heartland of South Sudan. There is a small community called Dinka Church, which is one of the sections of Dinka ethnic group. And of course, this community, with us, until over recent 2005, it has limited contact to the outside world, and songs continue to be the means of communications, either through intergeneration or through the community. And when I was there, of course, because this community was the part of my childhood upbringing, and I live a lot of memories personally, and also a lot of stories which are related to this community. And of course, listening to these stories when I was a young man, every story is accompanied by the song, and our singers are musician presenting his own experience of the grandfathers in songs. And I have to say that many of these songs in my community, of course, they are presented as like a form of individual experience, the form of individual encounters, reflecting on what happened to you, basically. Either experience of war, either experience of drought, either experience of suffering, or some of the indignities someone has lived in those difficult times or good times. And also even Arup mentioned about the history of revolutions, either British or the Mahdi state, which Arup also highlighted. And of course, the experience of these revolutions or political events are also felt by the people, either in form of violence, or either in form of misgovernance, or either in form of exploitative, form of interactions between the state and the people. And of course, the colonial administration, as some of us know, was described for bad and also for good. And I happen to experience the songs related to all these interventions, foreign interventions and also internal interventions. And people talk about this experience. Let's say people were talking about experience songs related to taxation, which the British introduced to the people. And people were taxed in form of cows and goats, which of course were the basic resources of the communities. So when people sing about these things which are new in their life, things of course which change their lives, and how they engage with this, it gives me a scope when I was undertaking this course with the Osun management, the Osun Society, for to do this research around the songs. So when I was doing this, of course, I went to the community, talked to some of the singers, talked to some of the elders from the community, interviewed them about their memories, and also the songs. Because when the person is telling a story, will sing a song, and this song, of course, will reflect some of the big elements about particular experience. Of course, these are basically agro-pastoral communities. And they lived and their livelihood rotate around cattle husbandry and rain-fed agriculture, which are the major, economic activities throughout calendar years, and of course seasonal fishing, which is also one one of their occupations. So someone will be wondering how diverse are these songs. Of course, just in this community, for some of us who watch Indian movies, of course, this is like the general description of this community. Everything that is done, of course, the memory is recorded through songs and also through this experience. So there are diverse, undertaking of songs. If people are talking about the spiritual songs, which of course I narrow down my studies into 3 categories on songs: the spiritual songs, the songs of war and peace, and then the songs of courtships and marriages, which personally I got them very fascinating when they come to orality and how people remember events. So the songs of spiritual songs, of course, they relate to our gods, not the one God we believe in. Of course, we have many gods, but we have chosen to have one God. And the song of gods, because we have all these divinities, we have our own spiritual beliefs as families, as clans, as communities. And in cultures like the culture of this Dinka church people, where I conducted these studies, people focus so much on songs when it comes to religions, because in Kenya generally people may remember recent songs, but in this community where limited information is documented, people can go back to generations, 4 generations, 5 generations, and sing about things related to particular, either at a family level or a clan level, about their experience, different experience about the spiritual or the natural happening. Because of us, we believe that nothing happened by nature, but everything happened through grace of God. And we have songs of war, as Arubu was saying. I know the British intervention was the late 18th century. And of course, many people still remember all this experience of slavery or pacification, British pacification, when some of these communities, hostile agro-pastoral communities, were brought under governance through the use of force. And many people could go back, to retell these stories and sing the songs to accompany this. And you can explain very well from the songs that many communities, in their experience, like cattle as being a central picture to their livelihood and being deprived of all these resources, are reflected in some of these stories. And how do they fit in here? Like the songs, the general role of songs in community, which is the central theme of my studies, is the songs stand in the memory of cultures and the memory of experience, this common experience. And I know people talk about counseling, people talk about trauma healing, but this, of course, memories. You're thinking someone who experienced the indignities of being tortured or being deprived of this cattle by the government or the pacification force. So you may compare your own story of suffering or your own story of you may consider to be very painful to someone who experienced something even more damaging than you. It's not about traces of history, but in my community, of course, and where I conducted this research, songs stand in the place of the modern radios. They stand in the place of the modern newspapers and also televisions. Of course, everything is shared through songs, and of course, all this form the element of the bigger folklore and understanding of the greater community collective memory. Just to conclude, I know songs, of course, when it comes to experience of of the community or doing historical research, people tend to focus on material culture than some of these subculture likes. And of course, this is one of the most understudied landscape. And as the time goes, because my area of focus was so specific, I'm going to venture into studies of these songs and understand some of the areas greatly. I know the time is limited. I'm going to give space for the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Machot. I want to appreciate that presentation. It was wonderful. Machot was actually advised by Jock, and Jock had a bit of challenge, so at the end of it, Dr. Nyairo came in handy and assisted Majok quite a bit, Machot. So I want to move straight to Kiprop. Kiprop must also be there. And Kiprop, just take a few minutes because our time is now completely spent. You're welcome. Actually, Kiprop, are you there? I can see Kiprop. Kiprop is actually a writer, fiction writer. And at the moment, he is writing quite a bit. He has written a lot of fiction that have appeared in quite a number of papers, like Kwani, Jadala, No Token, Kafiko, and presently is writing at Donholm. So please share your slide and present kindly. Thank you.
Oh, so in my proposal, I was reconstructing the memories of the oldest generations of people from Irong location in Elgeyo Marakwet. And so you can hear me? Yes, and you can see my screen? So I was presenting stories from the elders of Irong. Irong is a location that stretches from the Kerio Valley to the Uasin Gishu Plateau. It's one of the many territorial divisions of the Keio people. So the Keio people, originally they lived along the Kerio Valley escarpment to be safe from the surrounding tribes of Karamojong and Maasai and Nandi. It was a difficult terrain, and they organized themselves in such a way so that every person in the community could have access to the Kerio River. And Irong was one of those locations. There are about 21 territorial divisions among the Keio. So Irong was originally a location confined to the Kerio Valley, but as the surrounding social and political sphere changed with colonization, and when inter-ethnic conflict stopped, the Keio obviously moved from down the valley to the highlands, and this location that was only meant to be confined to the valley stretched upwards. So it now stretches down from the Kerio Valley to the Uasin Gishu Plateau. The people of Irong have similar age sets to the rest of the Kalenjin people, and it's a rotating system. So you have Kipkoimet, Kaplelach, Kimnikeu, Nyongi, Maina, Chumo, Sawe, Korongoro, and the Kipkoimet give birth to the Kimnikeu give birth to the Maina give birth to the Sawe give birth to the Kaplelach give birth to the Nyongi. So it's just a very clear way of marking generations, and at any given time there's a generation that has not yet been born, and people in the community are anticipating the introduction, the bringing back of those ancestors into the community, because it's like the ancestors are being born again afresh. So we have clans, and among the Irong people there are several clans. The clans are similar to clans available in the bigger KU and Kalenjin community. These are some of the examples. We have Toyoi, Kimoi, Saniego, Siakwe, Teriki, Soti, Kobilo, Kabon, Sogomo, Talai. So these names, the names of the clans are carried by the women. And it's just a way of marking lineage so that if a woman is married into a new family, she comes along with, she's named after her father's clan. So a woman will be named Toyoi. So even if she's married into a new family, you know where she originally came from. And these clans they can have several totems, further subdividing them. The common totems are the crested crane, the buffalo, elephant, bee, monkey, snake, guinea fowl, rat, and thunder. Many people in the Toyoi clan are under the thunder totem. So I collected a number of stories from the elders, and I only quoted bits of it because it's very interesting. I wrote it like a story, flowing with a beginning, middle, and end. And the quotes that I shared here will not do it justice, but it kind of just offers a glimpse of the ideas about who they were. So one woman, Shiakwe, told me that the Keo loved beauty. You'd put everything you wanted on your neck. It was insulting to go anywhere with your neck empty. You'd say, "Kacholo lit cat, konosonae galat," something like that. Like, my neck can't be empty like that. You need to give me something to put around it. And I also love this quote from one of the people I spoke to. If you wanted to invite a friend for beer and he lived far, you'd hold a mirror at a special angle and reflect sunlight at his house. The mirror would shine at his place even if he was 2 kilometers away, and you would know you had an event at your own house to which you was invited. I think if we were left to live life to our own designs, we would have reached the moon. So I just love that that idea of people being left to progress with life through their own knowledge and through their own terms, and the advances that would have come as a result of that. So obviously, one of the most significant changes that the elders spoke about is our practices around death, because originally the Keo would leave dead people in the wilderness to be eaten by hyenas and other wild animals. And when the English and the Scottish came, they began burial practices with very specific rituals around it. Men were buried lying on their right, women were buried lying on their left, and burials were done in the evening when the sun was setting to mean that this person's life has also set. And this is a practice that is done up to today, because among the Keo, we bury people in the evening. One of the books that I was reading regarding my project was Kwame Anthony's Appiah, The Lies That Bind. And I picked this quote from him: "Identities work only because once they get their grip on us, they command us, speaking to us an inner voice. And because others, seeing who they think we are, call on us too. If you do not care for the shapes your identities have taken, you cannot simply refuse them. They are not yours alone." So I was looking at the stories these people told me through this lens that Kwame Anthony has offered. And one of the things I realized is that there was nothing obviously essential about coming from Irong or being Keo, because even Irong itself was not meant to be a human identity. It was only meant to be a demarcation. But over time, people in this specified division got very specific experiences that marked Irong as an identity. One of the things I discovered, for example, is that the Catholic Church was mostly situated along Irong, and it created a difference in what the people of Irong accessed through education, through their habits, their relation with alcohol, because the Catholic Church was more tolerant to alcohol than the Protestant Church. And there's another KO territorial division called Medkay. Medkay means Medkeo. Medkeo means the head of the KO. And the Protestant Church proselytized the people of Medkay much more than the Catholic Church, and many of them went to school earlier than the people from Irong, and many of them also kind of avoided alcohol more than the people of Irong. So the people of Medkay got educated earlier, and they got more opportunities that, if you look back in retrospect, you can see how the people of Irong were somehow, in some ways, left behind because of the various forces around them that were different from the forces around other KO territorial divisions. So from the stories, identity was perceived through beauty, through land, through language, through how people were named. And there was also like a fluid sense of identity that came across in the manner in which people responded to change. So considering that identity is not a specific essential thing, but it's a constant interrogation, people have an inner and external dialogue with themselves and with their societies to kind of pinpoint who they are, or to find ways into fitting into an identity that they were born into, and constantly shifting it as the forces around them shift. So these are the interrogations that I was very curious about when speaking to these elders. Like, how did they interrogate and conclude about their own sense of identity as people from Irong? But not only that, because they existed in, each one of them existed in a plurality and a multiplicity of identity. I just wanted to know how they balanced all those various forms of identities attached to them, their religion, them being Kenyans, them being Kalenjin, them being KO, them being people from Irong. I was just curious about the conversations they had with themselves and their societies about their various identities and how they made peace with that. So what that linger in my mind from this project is, how do personal and local interrogations of identity contribute to its definition within a society, and eventually to perceptions of citizenship within a country? Especially because we come from a country, I mean, every nation requires people to see themselves as citizens first before they go to their ethnic identity. But then when you look at Kenya, one of the many ways that Kenya organizes itself, both socially and politically, is through tribe. So your ethnic identity is also a way of you being a citizen to your country, but at the same time, you're supposed to be a citizen first. So I was just curious how the elders were interrogating this conversation among themselves and within themselves. And the second question, how do people negotiate and make peace with the plurality of their identities, the personal, the ethnic, the religious, and the national? How do they balance the multiplicities of its different demands? So that's the other question that I settled on. And thank you. That's my presentation.
Kiprop, thank you so much, Kiprop. You're quite loud. He is actually sending me word and saying, please apologize on my behalf because I'm trapped in a place where there's no network. And he's been using his phone, actually. That is the situation we are in Kenya. Sometimes there are places that are very, very remote, and they've worked through a lot of difficulty. Now, this particular panel, the discussion panel, is definitely going to be moderated by Sharath. And I already introduced him in the morning, and he warned me when we were eating lunch, don't introduce me again. But he's actually governance, you know, he's a co-director, Center of Governance and Human Rights. So when he says don't, then I say no, I will not. So please feel welcome. Sorry for feeling so lonely. They were together with Dr. Magoha, but just like I mentioned, the literature department, they are having their exams, so both of them have had to leave. And you're not alone because Dr. Nyairo is up here, so please take over and guide us. Then these people have been listening so keenly, I was looking at them. They can now have an opportunity to also talk.
Thank you, Rosemary. So I'm going to first suggest that Joyce gives a few words on the presentations, and then I think we'll be opening it up to questions and comments. I mean, it was such a rich set of presentations, and I don't know about others, but I felt like I traveled to many places really close to worlds and histories and communities and song, and yeah, it was a really rich set of presentations, so hopefully lots to discuss. So get your questions and comments ready. But Joyce, if you're online, can I ask you to go ahead and give your comments from the three presentations? Oh, she's talking. Yes, you're online now.
Thank you very much. I realize that we've run out of time, started so late and so on. So what I was trying to do is conflate my comments to cut across the three presentations. I think the fundamental thing I want to say is, very often when people describe communities as oral, the implication is that there is a fine divide between oral societies and literate societies, whereas in my experience and understanding, all societies are oral, all of them, even if they're using sign language. And so the fundamental thing always for me to trace with this orality is the how of it, the why of it, the when of it. So give it that substance. And what I noticed is that very often, even when people said they were talking about the songs, I wasn't hearing the songs. And this is what I'd love to see more of. I realized that we had to do a lot of work in creating the context of the different places that people were studying, but what I really wanted to hear was the substance of the material itself, allow it to speak. And I hope that, when the work is written up and completed, this is what will happen, that we will allow the material to speak itself and then give it that analysis that allows us to subject the orality to certain instruments and to see what work it is actually doing. The other fascinating thing, of course, is the ways in which places define people, because all of these presentations were really concerned with issues of identity. And that idea of how places define people, both as a physical landscape, but also in terms of the kind of contexts of colonialism, for example, contexts of war, physical strife, or drought, what kind of people do you become? And why this for me is an important question, and I think it came out of all of the papers, is that identity is always in construction. We will like to think of these communities as fixed. We like to think of them as representing very particular things, but in actual fact, those things are fairly fluid. They are subject to change. So that, for instance, Kim Tai's work, which I'm more familiar with, the attempt to fit the people of Irong into a sub-ethnic community or into a nation, in as much as that might, at certain instances, be resisted, you listen to these stories from the elders, and you realize that they were always adapting. At no point was the identity of the people of Irong fixed in place. It was always subject to interrogation. It was subject to adaptation. It was subject to borrowings. And so this, for me, is a very interesting part of the work, how identity is fluid and the circumstances that shape it all the time, but also why at certain points in time, people will want to project themselves as one static thing and not anything else. So what is being served in that particular moment Is it resources at a particular level? Is it representation in political terms? What is it that they're trying to do in that moment when they, quote unquote, freeze their identity? And so these, I think, are some of the more fascinating things that come out of these presentations. And I really don't want to take more time like that than that unless I have to. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. You're free to come in again, so don't rush away. And if you have any questions for the presenters, very happy to hear them as well. Arub, do you want to come up, actually, just in case anyone would like to ask you a question? Does anyone have any questions? I've certainly got a couple of comments and perhaps questions. Rosemary, yes? Oh, excellent. Okay.
He was actually asking that Arop in particular, because that's what he actually saw. Which theories did you use in interpreting your data? And he actually said that as you think about that, can you refer to this particular writer? It's called Ethnopoetics by Dennis Tedlock and Dale Helms. Then he also asked that how credible were the oral testimonies given to ethic research? Are you able to tell us the credibility in terms of, how valid, how reliable was the data that you collected? But otherwise, he said he loved the whole presentation. He longed to continue to be here. Thank you.
So, Arub, I'll pass that over to you.
Thanks for the questions. In terms of theories, one of the most important things that I was worried about is I don't want to take people into our insecurities as anthropologists when it comes to theorizing and contextualizing things. I came from a very classical anthropology school, and so I always put what people said at the first priority, which is the main source of information I have. But then this time it was more of engaging with texts that were produced historically, and there were so many narrations actually out of these texts, and that actually made me think about ethnography as a way of data collection itself. It made me rethink about this because we always go to the field, we ask people about their perceptions and worldviews, we put this down, we try to make an analysis meaningful out of that. But then how, text and literature kind of information can add to this, and how can we compare the two together was what I was interested to see. And I realized that actually people would use and refer to this text in a way or another while they were talking about themselves, but they were use it very differently. It depends on who they are and what their positionality is, which was also very interesting to look at. I was interested in looking at theories related to indigenous groups and indigenous rights movement. I was looking at New Zealand, for example. The literature has been written about becoming indigenous at some point, how the movement of indigenous rights have been shaped and reshaped based on political transformations that is going on, not just in far areas as New Zealand or Australia, but as the Maasai here in Africa. And I was looking also on what has been written on Bija themselves, and I found that there is so many studies that focused on Bija, but from a very linguistic side of approach, which is dealing with what the Bija have said in their literature, in their poems, but not directly involved with them and immersed in their daily life, and how do they actually deal with these texts in their daily life. And this is what I was looking at, how the text is functional in the daily activities. In terms of how credible the oral testimonies is, that was my question, since I remember when we had this oral literature seminar, I was always asking about how can we trust the oral testimonies. And then I believe that what is more important than credibility, because I keep thinking that historian and linguistic people are more interested in coming with the truthful narration. For me, I was more interested not in getting the final, the most correct version of the story, but rather to see why there is divergent versions of that story and how these different narrations came to be alive and why people are using it. Of course, some of them have some credibility over others because they have been documented, analyzed by a lot of researchers, and also it had a lot of evidences from the field. But at the end of the day, I believe each and every narration of this is telling a story for us. And I remember I went to the Sudan archive trying to find some documents about the Bija's history, and it was very interesting because I found someone coming from Red Sea. He was an Umda, which is a local leader from Red Sea, and he was bringing all of his fellows with him, looking at the archives for documents in order to prove that the port is their ancestors' property. And they were using the same documents that we as researchers were looking for. So, using literature or using history, even documented history as an evidence is not something related only to academia. It is what these people are doing. And they have their very much critical views about what has been written and documented about them in terms of historical, academic histories at least. Yeah. Sorry, I think I talked too much.
That's fine. Kiprop and Mashot, if you want to think about that question of sources and which ones are quote-unquote authentic, which ones are credible, how they're contested, I don't know if either of you have any comments on that. Mashot, if you want to go first, please go ahead.
Thank you for your wonderful question. Of course, the question of being authentic is a difficult question to answer from the perspective of orality. Of course, when I was doing these interviews, the first thing is to ask about particular old songs, if one can remember. And I may take you back to 4 generations, or the 3 generations, or I mention a particular event. Someone will start with, of course, with telling a story about this and who were the people who were there. And then he will, this was the song. And then he will say the name of the person who composed this song. And he will start, painting a picture, which of course will give you a clue about the places, because I don't know in other societies, because I never conducted any research about songs, outside these cultures where I conducted this research. And I have a picture of these songs because there are so many, some of them up to now I haven't completed it. These things, transcribing them. But they give you even places, either this was happening during the day or it was happening during the night. Either it was, a high of the flood, of the flooding, or it was a dry season. Because it gives that element of, of vivid memory of a particular event. When if you were not there, it will give you that picture. So when you relate to a story, which maybe you heard it before, or you read it in a text somewhere about, let's say, about the Mahdi state, which some of us in our high school we study, it will give you a picture of of the similar situation you had before. So this is where I considered that songs in particular are more authentic than the story, which may lose, a picture, a vivid picture of how it happens. So this is how I can say about why I appreciate songs in terms of being authentic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mashad. And Kiprop, do you want to say anything on this? I know there's a couple of questions as well before we wrap up. But
Yes.
Please go ahead.
So obviously, when you call a memory up, you're constructing and inventing that memory for that moment. You're speaking to me, and you have your own ideas about speaking to me. You have a way that you want to present yourself. But I think there's an integrity to that invention that is truthful, even if it might be a little distorted, because it's within a context that has to make sense. So if they're creating a fiction around their memory, it has to make sense within the wrong context. And I think that is truthful in itself. And I think one of the things that I was watching out for, because people remember different times differently, I was just watching the variances between the different stories, and those variances were also a part of the overall story. So those variances, those things that they didn't exactly say, those gaps between their many narratives was very important to my project as well. And another thing, I found it much more interesting when the elders were not talking to me directly, but talking to each other, because they could question and interrogate themselves more on their memories. Because one of the most interesting conversations, which I didn't include in my project, was about alcohol, making of alcohol. And as children, who could drink alcohol when it wasn't yet fully ripe, but it had reached a certain stage where children could be given a little of it to sip because there was very little food. And they had like so many memories around it, and they just went on and on, even forgetting that I was there. Or about slaughtering goats. So like when the elders were talking to each other, it was so vibrant, it was so alive, and it was such an opportunity for me to watch out for the variances and just, absorb it in. And then finally, like what Machot said, songs, especially children's songs, are so authentic because I think they just come as they are, and they record the actual truths of very specific moments in history, which are kind of forgotten but now only live through the song. So yeah, that is it.
Thank you, Kiprop. Thank you, Mashot. I'm going to wrap up very soon. I can't read that, but what does it say? Our time is up. I am sorry. There was a couple of questions, and I don't know if there's any chance for a comment. If anyone wants to make a comment from the floor, that's just to wrap up the session. Otherwise, one comment.
So my comment, thank you very much, all three of you. My comment, which doesn't need an answer because we're out of time, is that I was really excited that we're going to hear poetry or hear stories or hear songs, and we didn't, even though the research was great. And maybe this goes back to the comment from Joyce, that she wanted the material and the findings to be front and center. But imagine if you flipped your presentations around and started, for example, in your case, with a poem, and then contextualize the poem. And that way it would give us the context, but it would put the voices of your interlocutors front and center, which is what your absolutely fascinating research really wanted to show. Because what you wanted to say, and I think that was really great, the line at the end when you were saying it was so interesting how the poetry was shaping their lives, and then we could have actually had the whole presentation shaped by the poetry, or in the cases of the other presentations, the stories instead. So it's a plea for the most exciting stuff at the start of a presentation, and the use of not only PowerPoints, but also recordings and readings as well.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a really constructive piece of advice, especially for you guys are working with such amazing material, and I think a lot of us who can continue to do research, it's such a luxury to be able to work with this material, and it's so special. And you think that you need to talk to us about the big grand picture upon which it stands, but actually this is the work that is so important. I really enjoyed being a moderator for this panel. I want to ask us all to thank our three presenters and Joyce, who's still online, for her comments as well. So please, a round of applause. Very exciting to see what this fellowship has been able to produce. So thank you. I'll hand it over to Rosemary.
Thank you so much. I think it's just about time. That's why we can't do everything we want to do. People's hands are up, and when you leave them up, you know, it's like we are not going to be friends anymore. So we really appreciate what has gone on. I want to appreciate Dr. Nyairo. She has really been of help in this fellowship. She actually had, of course, she was the advisor of Kiprop, but when we had issues with Machot, she had to come in. Whenever we wanted something, or you know, anything, she would say, I'm available, and so she did it. She's actually a researcher in cultural memory, and she has extensively written. Some of the things she's written include 10 cities, Kenya at 50. So Nyairo, may God bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharath, for guiding this particular session. We really appreciate, because you actually advised Akoko. Akoko is there, and we still appreciate the whole thing. To all of us, thank you for the patience. Thank you for, you know, your inputs and everything else. Tomorrow, we are going to start early. When you see the program, you realize by 8:15, we should be done, so that we should be starting, so that by 1, we go, because there are those who are traveling tomorrow night. So I want us to just rise, and then we have the national anthem, and we wish you all the best. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Our team, please.
Nguvu yetu.
Driving and riding without incidences on the road is such an amazing experience. But do you know, while many road traffic